Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Neighbors, Friends, and Families online learning session titled Expanding the Circle, Inclusive Intimate Partner Violence, IPV Prevention Education for 2SLGBTQIA+ victims and survivors. This online learning session aims to share recent updates to the NFF public education campaign, including changes to the training materials and the NFF website. This session aims to highlight key changes designed to better include 2SLGBTQIA+ victims and survivors in IPV education, with the goal that NFF's resources are more accessible, affirming, and inclusive. Before we introduce and welcome our presenters, I'd like to start with a land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that we are learning, speaking, and hosting this virtual event on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lenampewak, and Chenungton nations. These lands are connected with the London Township and Sombra Treaties of 1796 and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum. Today, this land continues to be home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island. We give our deep respect to the first inhabitants of this land and recognize that an acknowledgement of Indigenous land and sovereignty comes with the responsibility to understand the history and ongoing impacts of settler colonialism. These impacts continue to be felt in disproportionate and everyday ways against Indigenous communities. Specifically, we recognize that today, these communities face disproportionate forms of gender-based violence and a crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and 2SLGBTQIA+ peoples. We also reflect on those who came to this land involuntarily, particularly those brought to these lands because of the transatlantic slave trade and slavery. We aim to continue to work collaboratively with communities to challenge colonialism, systemic racism, and further forms of oppression that remain pervasive in Canada and that result in disproportionate impacts of gender-based violence against Indigenous communities. Next, I'm pleased to introduce and welcome today's presenters, Tara Buchanan and Michaela Peach. They are members of WorQshop, Building Safer Spaces, are collaborators on the newly updated NFF resources that will be shared today during the session. Tara Buchanan is a queer activist and coordinator of the Bridge Brand, a grassroots organization. Tara aims to identify and address inequities experienced by 2SLGBTQIA+ communities. With her extensive experience, she has been actively involved in promoting inclusivity for over 13 years, leading 2SLGBTQIA+ inclusion trainings with WorQshop, including many within the IPV sector, and serving as the former chairperson of Brantford Pride. Tara is deeply engaged in fostering a sense of belonging with the goal of creating welcoming and inclusive communities where everyone can feel valued and accepted. Welcome, Tara. Michaela Peach is a white, queer, non-binary person born and raised in Southern Ontario, but recently moved to Halifax, Nova Scotia, which is the traditional territory of the Mi'kmaq people. Michaela has a Bachelor of Arts from Wilfrid Laurier University with a major in human rights and human diversity. They have experience in the field of peer support, sex worker rights and advocacy, and working with 2SLGBTQIA+ youth. They are passionate about community building, and their ongoing work focuses on 2SLGBTQIA+ rights and advocacy. Welcome, Michaela. Welcome both. I will now pass it over to you to begin your presentation, and I look forward to rejoining you during the Q&A.
Thank you, Margarita. We're really grateful that we were asked to partner on this project with Neighbours, Friends, and Family. So basically how that started was Neighbours, Friends, and Family reached out to us to see if we could do a bit of a review of their training materials, their website, and it has been a really interesting journey for us, I think, as well as for me personally. Many years ago, I started my work in social work in a women and child assault counselor and advocate course. And So this has always been something though I haven't worked in that field in many years, this is something that is close to my heart. So I was really happy to be able to look at these materials. So what we did is we reviewed the amazing online resources that Neighbors, Friends, and Family already had. Um, we thought they were so informative, but we did see that there maybe was some need, some tweaks that could be provided to have a bit of a different lens. So we looked at the training specifically. We made a pamphlet that we will also go through. And then there is a separate section that we also added to the Neighbors, Friends, and Family website. And we do want to express that it really actually is important to be embedded in everything. If it feels like an add-on to something, if there's all your regular information and then just a 2SLGBTQIA section, sometimes that can feel very exclusionary or othering, sort of like a side note. So just being mindful of that. And I think that working together, we have created some really, or enhanced the resources that were already there. So some of the main things, or sorry, actually, we're going to first just talk about some of the history. So in the 1970s and 80s, intimate partner violence was commonly framed as sort of like a helpless, battered woman and a controlling, abusive man. This, of course, shaped the way that society in general views, and all of the strategies and awareness, any type of interventions were all sort of based on this view. It reinforced cis heteronormativity and who the survivors and perpetrators were. Of course, this is in all intimate partner violence narratives and all things that have come out of those movements. So, and the great work that there was a lot of great work that was done, but I can say, so when I took the course right out of high school, so I hate to age myself like this, but it was actually in the very, very early 2000s. So quite a ways into a lot of the work that has been done. I still had this real feeling that it was not for me. So identifying as a lesbian, I did feel like a lot of it, I was in a great course with many actually queer teachers, but a lot of the resources still felt very, very gendered and like they didn't apply to me. So then we look at the consequences of those narratives. They really do enforce a certain idea, and it dictates how research is done. It dictates how services are set up. It really does affect all aspects of the movement. So there was always a lot of stigma and invisibility within shelter systems and support systems. And I think in society in general, I really didn't see myself represented. A lot of the campaigns that were, I can envision them when I was younger, the commercials that would come on TV, they really did. And not that it's not a problem. I think that that is still an important message to get across to people, but I didn't see myself represented in them at all. And I almost felt like this wasn't something that was going to happen to me as a lesbian. Like it wasn't even a possibility. It also created barriers for inclusion and affirming care. Not intentionally, of course, maybe intentionally on some folks' part, but I really do think for the most part, not an intentional outcome. So the other part is, unfortunately, a lot of the education pieces that are happening are still very binary. And this really affects students, particularly in schools, youth, and let's face it, we learn a lot through the grapevine. So even though there is public education and as well as education in school, the prevailing feelings or thoughts of society is really what can shape how we think about ourselves and our place. So I do feel like these still have pervasive effects today. As a result, many service providers aren't equipped to recognize or respond to the full range of experiences that people have, and it can undermine trauma-informed and inclusive supports. And like I said earlier, lots of people do not see themselves represented in this area. Or if they reach out, sometimes it's the most vulnerable that you maybe have been reaching out for help. And then sometimes if supports are not inclusive, it can actually just derail the reaching out, which I have heard from many people. I think things are working in a direction people are really trying, but because of the way, I think it's more systemic, because of the way these services are set up, even when we are trying to make them more inclusive as a community, it is challenging because they are so gendered. Um, so Michaela is actually going to go over our pamphlet and some of the recommendations we made so that hopefully services can feel more inclusive.
Yeah, thank you, Tara. And just to echo the points that you made as well, um, I remember coming out when I was 18 and thinking to myself that it's not even something that could happen to me. And so when it did happen to me, I didn't recognize it for a long time. And that like point of reaching out for help, I think was extended a lot because I didn't see myself in those resources. So I think that's a really important point to drive home, and we'll probably touch on that a couple more times. But for now, this is a part of the work that we did in collaboration with neighbors, friends, and family. One of the key outcomes was creating this pamphlet that is available on the website, and we will show that a little bit later. But the main points that we wanted to touch on in the pamphlet to get more information out there was some information about what it means to be 2S LGBTQIA+. I think a long acronym like that can kind of get lost, like what each of the letters means and how do you know if that applies to someone. So we wanted to get at least that definition in the pamphlet, as well as touch on some of the statistics around intimate partner violence in 2S LGBTQIA plus relationships, because it's very limited. Given that 2S LGBTQIA plus people are still so marginalized in Canada, we have very little access to research and viable statistics to point to what is actually going on in these relationships. So a lot of the like best practices, so to speak, kind of come from anecdotal research, or I guess anecdotal research is kind of an oxymoron, but it comes mostly from anecdotes and word of mouth, the grapevine. Like Tara said, you hear about it happening with people you know. I work in the field, not directly, but I indirectly work with a lot of IPV survivors, and often those folks are queer and are not really sure where they should even start with accessing services because they feel like it doesn't apply to them. Um, so we wanted to include some statistics about the prevalence of IPV in 2S LGBTQIA plus relationships. And then if I can navigate to the next slide, I'm not sure that I can. Oh, there we go. So this is the main part of the pamphlet. This is inside. So we wanted to include some information about what neighbors, friends, and families need to know about IPV in 2S LGBTQIA plus relationships. Just some of the main points for supporting folks and, kind of the best practices. So we wanted to talk about withholding gender affirming care and medications, controlling gender expression, outing or threatening to out a partner. And we'll talk a bit more about that, I think, when we get to the webpage. Isolating from community and found family, extreme jealousy and possessiveness, and misgendering and homophobic/transphobic abuse are some of the main points that we wanted to touch on. And we wanted to make sure that that was in the pamphlet so that it's like a quick resource that someone could pull up while they're sitting with someone that they're supporting, or they could pull up and look at that for themselves and think, okay, yeah, this kind of is what I'm dealing with, and not so specifically about like a man and a woman, but like some things that are specific to us LGBTQIA plus relationships. We wanted to give some pointers on what you can do to help. And this is going to be specific to the person that is trying to access supports and the situation that they're in. But some of the, like, again, overall best practices, and I think really things that could help with supporting IPV victims as a whole. These are things that can help create better practices and safer spaces, not just for queer and trans folks, but also for cisgender and heterosexual folks as well. We wanted to remind folks to recognize and challenge their biases, to use inclusive language when possible, consider intersectionality, support with compassion and understanding, being realistic about supports, but also creative. Because it might not look exactly how you would expect to support someone. It's a lot of people tend to think like, okay, the main thing that we have to do is get you away from the abusive partner. But sometimes it's more complicated than that. And so we wanted to give some tips on that, as well as prioritizing the safety of yourself and others. And we will touch on trauma-informed care. Definitely we'll touch on that more when we get to the webpage. Um, yeah, there are some unique challenges that are specific to 2SLGBTQIA plus support and IPV. And so thinking about how to work with those challenges is a very important part of that process. And I think the next page is actually the training, right?
Yeah, so we're not going to go through the whole training. It's fantastic. I found it very helpful going through it and reading it. So if you get an opportunity, please do look on the Neighbours, Friends, and Family webpage. The pamphlet can actually be found at the bottom of the 2SLGBTQIA section on the webpage if you're looking for the pamphlet, and is printable so that you can have it available. And it really does summarize. It's just a summarization of the full of the page.
Webpage. Yeah.
Yeah. We actually can't see the landing page of the training.
Oh,
We
yes.
can just see
Can you
it.
see it now?
Yes, excellent.
Okay.
So this is the Neighbors, Friends, and Family training. And obviously, I should have said earlier, I'm sure many of you are familiar, but Neighbors, Friends, and Family is really focusing on community members and how they can get involved and have an impact and really address what's happening in our communities, or at least feel like they have the information to be able to pass on to folks or help in some way if they or someone they know is involved in intimate partner violence. So when we were looking at this, we were trying to see how we could help. Either maybe somebody is coming to this because they are experiencing IPV and they want to get an idea. Maybe they have questions, or they're just thinking about it, or maybe it's a friend or family member, a neighbor that has maybe some suspicions or questions. So that's who we really addressed all of these points to. So some of the things that really stood out to me on the page were statistics. So really important. When we first got onto the training page, you can just go into the introduction if you want, Michaela. I think it's the easiest one, and you can sort of scroll a little bit. We won't pull up the videos or anything like that. But I believe it's actually in this section, or sorry, it's a bit further down. There is statistics. So a couple of the things we noticed is, one, first, language. So Neighbours, Friends, and Family, or NFF, had already sort of started to look at the language on their website and in their training, which was great. It's really important to have that it states women and trans folks on the page, because what happens is, if people have already made the assumption, and it might not even be that that's the case with your organization or who you're working with, but if they already have maybe had a negative experience, and we're talking about that trauma-informed lens, people are going to think that this doesn't apply to them. So then to see themselves actually labeled or listed is like, okay, actually, I am included in this. This could be for me. This service could be for me. And also, this might be happening to me, which is very important. Also, we noticed that pictures, we know representation is very, very important in the world, and pictures are a huge piece of that representation. So, obviously, we know the majority of folks that are experiencing IPV are women. But the other folks need to be represented as well, and feminine women. But there are also masculine women. There are many people. So to have all of those identities represented was really important. And they've done a good job of updating that. And then the last piece was the statistics. So we noticed, I'm just going to read some of them. I don't want to make a mistake, so I'm going to actually read them. Actually, Michaela has them up there. So 44% of women report experiencing IPV, 36% of men, 64% of trans women report experiencing IPV, 67% of queer women report experiencing IPV, and 54%, or sorry, yeah, 54. Sorry, I thought I read it wrong. 54% of queer men report experiencing IPV. So though the largest number of folks, because there are so many heterosexual relationships in the world, that is the largest number of people that are experiencing this. Statistically, if we're looking at the risk factor for people, it is significantly higher in the queer community. And I think just having these stats here speaks volumes to the community, but also to their neighbors, also to the people that love them, to say, hey, this is a reality. And I think we're going to talk about it in later pieces, but I don't know how many times I heard, I don't know if people feel that, two men fighting is sort of like an even match, so it doesn't matter. And that's absolutely, absurd. There's so many things about that statement that are problematic, but I've also heard many times in my life, oh, your relationship must be, amazing because it's two women. Well, all relationships have struggles. And we know that, so knowing that, we can see how it can be misunderstood in community. So having these stats here really helped. There was pieces woven in through the whole website as well as through this whole training. Those are just some examples that really stood out to us that I wanted to touch on. I think now we'll go to the actual, Michaela's helping me because nobody wants me to have to talk and navigate a website. So Michaela has been super helpful in volunteering to do that for us today. And then they're going to go over this section.
Yeah, so there's three main sections to the webpage that we created with the wonderful help of Neighbors, Friends, and Families tech team, because none of us on the team are super techie. I couldn't have done this. But we wanted to really focus on having some definitions. I think personally, as a queer person navigating this world, I still come across a lot of folks who just don't know what the definitions are, which is totally fine. Not everyone has to know everything, but I think having language really helps to make people feel safe and comfortable when they're accessing services, as well as it can help an individual feel safe to have a label that represents them. Makes you feel comfortable, it helps you find community, and it gives you like a better understanding of who you are. And so we didn't want to skip on the definitions. I'm not going to go through all of these, but they are available on the website now. So going through what the different definitions are, we define the acronym, some other terms, intersex, non-binary, and kind of sussing out the differences between some of these terms that have similar definitions. We wanted to focus on that, as well as giving some language that would come up specifically when supporting 2SLGBTQIA plus victims/survivors. So things like outing, which refers to the act of exposing someone's 2SLGBTQIA plus identity. Now, this this term, I wouldn't say it's an outdated term. It's definitely something it is still very relevant today. I think the thing that has changed a little bit is that people don't necessarily see outing as big of a deal because there is more queer and trans representation in media and in the world in general. So people, I think, unintentionally will out people thinking that it's just, well, it's just like anything else now. Like you don't even have to worry about being out to your landlord or your employer. But it is still very much an issue for 2SLGBTQIA plus folks. And threatening to out someone to their employer, their landlord, their friends and family, even can be very dangerous and can have actual consequences for those folks, like losing their housing or losing the support of their friends and family, which is a very traumatic experience for anyone to go through, but also then further isolates a victim slash survivor from a support network that could help them. So we wanted to touch on that for sure. And then cis heteronormativity, which is basically a term for a system of beliefs, values, and behaviors that uphold cisgender and heterosexual identities as being the like normal, and everything else is abnormal, and shouldn't exist to some extent. Um, and this is a really important piece to understand when supporting 2SLGBTQIA plus victims and survivors, because this is the world that we live in. We live in this system of we live in the world of cis heteronormativity. So queer folks are already fighting against that system. And then when you add another layer of intimate partner violence, things get even more complicated. So we really wanted to make sure that there was some definitions about these really important terms that help to provide more understanding for service providers.
Yeah, and if I can just add to that, Michaela, so with cis heteronormativity, that is the number one thing. Like, of course, there is still homophobia, transphobia, biphobia, all the phobias still exist, and are happening. But at huge rates, what people are saying makes them not want to access services and makes them isolated is cis heteronormativity. It's when people make the assumption that cis and heterosexual people are the norm. And that is what people are saying when they go into services, when they access things. It's like the questions that people ask, the way that they ask them, the resources that they're provided. All of that is still very cis hetero. So they're saying that's what's impacting them more even on a day-to-day basis than homophobia, biphobia, transphobia. So that's a really important piece to touch on for sure.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so then the next section of the website, which I'll let Tara take from here, is what neighbors, friends, and families need to know. So again, we've already read out these some of these headings in the pamphlet. So the pamphlet's supposed to just be like the Spark Notes version. I don't know if people still know what Spark Notes is, actually. I realized I might have just aged myself as well. But the like short version is on the pamphlet, and then we elaborate on these points on the actual webpage.
Yeah, so if you can open them up. So really, there's a lot of great things to be aware of. We can just go one at a time, Michaela. So myths. So there are a ton of myths around IPV and the 2SLGBTQIA community. Some of them are listed here. So one of the main things, I already sort of mentioned it, this idea that there isn't intimate partner violence in queer relationships, and just that idea that people work it out amicably, or that there's no power dynamic or power differential, which is completely untrue. Power differentials can happen even if you are the same gender, but we also know that there are a variety of different genders within the 2SLGBTQIA plus community, not to mention the intersections that happen within those varying genders. So there can really be a power imbalance that happens, which then makes a really tricky situation for folks. And like I said, lots of people just feeling that this isn't something that happens in especially relationships of people who are identify as the same gender. Another one of the myths, is that the masculine person or the bigger, like the actual physically bigger person or the more masculine person in a relationship might be the aggressor or abuser. Again, complete myth. That might be the case. Of course, that could be true. Lots of queer couples, because they want to fit in, do try to emulate straight relationships because it is hard to be outside of the box and to not fit into the norms. But lots of people do not. I knew a woman who was telling me of her story. And it was so this woman actually experienced a disability, and her partner was very, very feminine, much smaller than her in stature, a very quiet person, but still was the person that was perpetrating, I won't say intimate partner violence, but definitely financial abuse, as well as emotional abuse. So it does fall in there, but there wasn't as much of the violent part as there was, which is it's still impactful and very harmful and problematic. So we can't fall into these stereotypes. And we'll go to the next one, lack of privacy.
Yep.
So in the queer community, it is a small community. Like it says here, I remember the first time I went on a dating website, almost everyone I know that popped up as a match for me, I sort of knew them already. I was older, so that didn't help. I was in my 30s the first time I went on a dating website, but everyone that popped up, I sort of knew, which was very disheartening. I have to be honest at that point in time, but it just speaks to how small the community actually is. Almost always, people know your partner. If you break up, your new partner is probably might know your old partner, and people talk. Right. We also have to remember that spaces are actually, I'll talk about that in the next section. But because it's so small and so many people know one another, I watched the Rural Roots one of these presentations, and I had to say it's not the same, it's very different, but the idea of people talking, right? Of people finding out what's happening and spreading through gossip is really concerning for people in the queer community because it is so close-knit and so small. So that is another barrier for folks. Also, then if we go down to isolation. So many people in the queer community, unfortunately, have had to cut relationships with family, or the relationship has been cut with family when they have come out. This is particularly challenging right now. When I was young, it was like gay and lesbian people were being disowned, mostly young gay men were being disowned by their family. But now trans folks, if it's their family of origin, then they are, becoming homeless. We know that there are very high statistics for folks that come out in their family of origin. But then we also have where if you decide to transition later in life, you can be ostracized from your children and your partner in that case. So it can be a very isolating experience when people come out. So then if you add on top of that, your partner might be your whole support system. And if that's the case, it can be extremely dangerous and scary to try to leave that situation. So isolation is a real key. Also, people can feel isolated from the community if the more rural they are too. So there are big communities in in thriving cities like Toronto, Edmonton, Montreal, there's big communities. But I work out of Brantford, Ontario. We're not that small a city. We're well over 100,000 people, but we really don't have many places or spaces to go. Most of them are actually, all of them are volunteer run. So there isn't a lot of funding and things of that nature either, which means that there are less resources and for places for people to connect. So that part can also make people feel very isolated. You might feel like you are the only queer person you know other than your partner.
And just to add, sorry, a little bit to that point about isolation, um, and kind of fighting against stigma, if you feel like you're already defensive about your relationship, because of queer phobia and transphobia, then you might already be willing to cut people off for questioning your relationship, which really exacerbates the isolation as well. I know in my personal experience, coming out and then being in a serious relationship and having the cisgender heterosexual people in my life kind of question what was going on in my relationship made me feel really defensive. And so I just kind of isolated what was going on in my relationship. And so my friends and family didn't even know until I was out of that relationship. And so I think isolation can take on many roles, like being isolated from your friends and family, but also isolating yourself from your friends and family to avoid the the comments, the microaggressions, and things like that.
Yeah. And that's a really good point, Michaela. I think we touch on that farther down. So thank you for bringing it up. And also the fact that you can then in turn be isolated. There's higher risk for your partner to isolate you as well.
Yeah.
If because there's a lack of privacy, like we said, the community is so small. So if there are jealousy issues and things of that nature, you might not be able to connect with community at all. And it makes it just compacts the effect of the isolation. There, of course, is a lack of services. It might not even be that there aren't services available, though we know I've worked with many, many organizations, shelters, things of that nature, and they really are making strides to try to be more inclusive. But if the community doesn't know it, then they still feel like there are no services. I will say when we were going through the website, I tried to find it before the training today, I tried to find it a few days ago. I tried to look up accessing services just for crisis lines, just to call so that we could embed it into some of the trainings. I could only find one in all of Canada. I can't remember what it was right now. Sorry, Ontario. It was Ontario, not all of Canada. That didn't specifically say women in the title. And now, of course, I think if you called those crisis lines, they would still accept. But if you've had a traumatic experience before where you felt excluded because of your gender, or if people are telling you that you're not a woman, sometimes that can be part of the abuse, which we're going to talk about in a few moments. Like if someone is telling you, you're not really a woman, then you're going to be really scared to access services that are just specifically for women.
And accessing services that you are hoping that they're safe and then having a negative experience really reduces the chances of that person reaching out to more services in the future. So it can actually be worse to advertise a service as being safe, and then that person goes and has a bad experience, or is misgendered, or is um facing some kind of homophobia in the space. They are much less likely to then try to access services again, because you're always thinking about, like, well, this is what happened last time and I'm not willing to put myself through that again. And so it's not just like the lack of services, but the violence that people are experiencing when they access services as well.
Yeah, and the general lack of funding that's happening for anyone experiencing intimate partner violence, right? So there's not always the funding to have single rooms or to access hotels or which partner are we working with here? What is the situation and what's the best way to work with them? And which or how are we going to work with both if that's the case? So
That's a
there's
good
just
one.
lots of nuances that I think people are working out on individual basis, but can be really tricky. So then Michaela actually talked on outing already, but outing is a huge piece of intimate partner violence that happens in the queer community. I don't know how many studies I read and how many people I know have been threatened to be outed. And we are not to judge. People know their own experience the best. And if they feel unsafe at a work environment or in a friend group or in a family, then we have to trust that there's a reason for that. It could be housing, it could be physical threat as well. So just that is one piece that is very, very heightened in the 2SLGBTQIA community. There's also a lack of healthcare in general for
Mhm.
particularly trans folks. Lots of people have to travel to get adequate healthcare, probably like hour to 2 hours away from their home. So people can actually withhold appropriate healthcare. People can take away or withhold medications. They can withhold money, which could be for healthcare needs. Lots of things are not covered. I know lots of times in media, it shows like it is covered, but there are tons of pieces of transitions and different pieces that are not covered. So someone can withhold finances, but also just withhold rides. Maybe you just need to get 2 hours away. And because of something that's happened, now your partner's saying, you know what, I'm not driving you anymore. And I'm not going to pay either for these, or you can't use my benefits anymore. Something like that. Especially when we know that disproportionately folks are making far less money. Well, we'll talk about that later, actually. So I'll leave that for now. But yes, healthcare is a huge piece that people are impacted by. There's also substance use. So there are much higher rates, mostly for coping mechanisms in the 2SLGBTQIA community. And we know that when substances are involved, I mean, you all know, we're not the experts in this field, but that risk factors go up when drugs and alcohol are a factor. And this plays out in many ways. Lots of times, queer community, historically, I would say more so than now, but still, I think it's prevalent that queer community is sort of built around places where substances are used. And then that can lead to more volatile situations for sure. And then I was speaking about the financial abuse aspect of it. There's a great stat in here. $15,000 is what the average trans person over half of the trans population in Ontario is living on. That is well below the poverty line. Okay, that is nominal. The interesting thing about this is, as our community, trans folks have the highest rates of education. So more per capita, the more trans people have university, college education, but actually make less than every other member of the 2SLGBTQIA. So there is huge opportunity, unfortunately, for people to end up in unfair power dynamics because of their income level and to be dependent on other people. This is also true for the rest of the queer community. Almost every lesbians, gay men, queer people in general statistically make less money and their jobs are more precarious. So this also is a huge piece if you're reliant on somebody else, but also just when times are tough, people are in risky situations. And it could be that you and your partner are both struggling, but that's going to make a situation even more risky.
Yeah, I was going to echo that exactly, actually, Tara, that poverty itself is an exacerbating factor for intimate partner violence. And certainly it is not a main factor. It doesn't cause intimate partner violence. So we don't want to imply that at all, but it is known that it is an exacerbating factor. Even something like losing a job or having a decrease in pay, having to take a lower paying job create stress in relationships and families that then exacerbates abusive power dynamics.
Yes, and then legal issues. So I sort of alluded to this earlier, but many people, when they come out in relationships, end up having to go to court, and there is still huge stigma, especially around gender variant folks, non-binary and trans folks, where people still consider it a mental health issue, unfortunately. And so then they have to fight for custody, or things of that nature. But also just not having proper identification sometimes if you have been transitioning and you maybe haven't had the ability to change all your identification over, this can be an issue. And not many people, like doctors, not many people have specialized training in 2SLGBTQIA in that area. So same with the legal folks. So if you are in a rural place, people might not know the best approach or the best way to address things or what exactly is needed. And this can also be a huge barrier for the community.
Mhm. So the final section of the website is what neighbors, friends, and families can do. So this is where we elaborate on some of the points that are in the pamphlet. So being aware of your biases and leaving them out of the conversation. It's really it's really important to be aware of our internal biases. Everybody has them. And so being aware of what your biases are and doing that self-reflection is a really important part of working with 2S LGBTQIA plus victims and survivors. Being able to move past that or at least put it aside for the time being is huge. We always want to keep intersectionality in mind, remembering that there can be overlapping concerns about race, disability, socioeconomic status, religion, and more. Location can be an exacerbating factor. Um, you know, having having a disability makes a big impact, as we can see through the statistics and the training. So being aware of what other risk factors might be important for the person that you're supporting. We always want to lead with compassion and understanding. And although there are some differences with how intimate partner violence shows up in 2S LGBTQIA plus relationships, we always want to treat victims and survivors with respect and care when we're providing support, regardless of what their background is. And being realistic and being creative. So in my personal experience as someone who works in the field and as someone who has been in a abusive relationship, being realistic about what can be done is really important. So you don't want to be promising survivors the world of like, we're going to get you out of there and you're going to get into housing and you and your family will be safe and you won't have to worry about it. That's just not realistic with the housing crisis that is happening. I mean, it's certainly happening in Halifax, and Nova Scotia as a whole, but I know it's happening across Canada as well. If you're promising someone that they're going to leave an abusive relationship and then have their own housing and they end up in a shelter for a prolonged period or an indefinite period of time, that is going to create a situation where they're going to want to go back to their partner because at least they had a house. At least they had their own room. At least they had somewhere to lay their head at night, that they didn't feel unsafe. Like they they had a bed to sleep in every night that wasn't just in a community center room with like 18 other cots in the room. So if you're able to support with a spare bed or a couch for someone to sleep on, or access to a vehicle, financial support, sometimes like $50, just so that, you can get a little bit of food, is amazing. But if not, if those aren't the resources that you have, look at what's available in your community and make sure that before you're suggesting that someone accesses a certain resource, that you are calling around. That is something that support support people can do is making those phone calls and asking those questions of these organizations. Like, are you going to be able to support a trans woman that's accessing services? And how are you going to do that? Not just do you do that, but how are you going to do that? Those are really important questions to be asking local services. And then if they say that they can't, then that's just not an option. So being realistic, but also being creative in, like if you have access to a second vehicle and being like, hey, you know what? Actually, I'll be able to lend you a car so that you can make it to your legal appointment. Or I have an extra bed in my house, or I know someone who has an extra room. Those things are like, they're the concrete ways that you can provide support without, just doing the typical, like, okay, I'll take you to the shelter sort of thing. Shelters are also often really unsafe for queer and trans folks. Um, and, they're not the safest place in the world for everyone, anyways. But for queer and trans folks, they can experience even more violence in a shelter situation. So, being very specific when you're accessing services about what the support would look like for that person. We always want to be prioritizing safety for yourself and others. I think that sometimes if you're supporting someone in an intimate partner violence situation, that you're not always thinking about what your safety looks like in that situation. But if you're a close friend or family member of a victim or survivor, you have to keep in mind that your safety is also a part of that conversation. If that person, the victim slash survivor's partner knows you, the perpetrator knows you, it can be an unsafe situation for you to put yourself into. So that might be a a time when you refer out to organizations that maybe have a degree of separation and work in that field all of the time, right? You can't neighbors, friends, and families can't be the only support. And necessarily so, that's why we have intimate part like IPV and GBV resources in communities. And then the last one is trauma-informed care. Now, this is a huge topic. We could have done a whole presentation on just trauma-informed care, but understanding the pervasiveness of trauma, and that services may unintentionally cause more trauma to victims and survivors. So keeping in mind the principles, and we would really encourage folks to read the blog post that's on the Neighbors, Friends, and Family website. It's linked on the new webpage. It's a great post that goes into more detail about what trauma-informed care is and why it's so important. And then the last section on the webpage is, of course, where you can download the brochure, and all of the information, or the jot notes version of the information, is available in the brochure.
So just looking at time, we were sure that we would end a little sooner than this. We might have time for a question, I'm not sure, but I just in closing, I would love to point out that we do realize that this is still a very gendered situation, but we can also include, we can open it up. And I think Michaela did a good point on touching on this. We can acknowledge that, the statistics show that men do, at least the most violent acts are generally by men and against folks that are more feminine, trans, or otherwise. Acknowledging that is fine, but we also want to open it up and sort of like a universal lens to make things more inclusive for everybody. And I think we'll be breaking down those stereotypes as well that maybe impact people coming forward in general, because we have such strict ideas about gender norms and things of that nature in society, maybe not in this field, but in general in the communities. So yeah, and also always looking at things intersectionally is really important. I also wanted to say too, on the trauma-informed piece, you just never know. Your services might be phenomenal, but if the community has had a negative impact or a negative experience in the past, or community member, It is very hard for them to know that. So outwardly stating and outwardly showing these things is really important. So someone knows, yes, I can access this. This is for me. Or maybe their friends are reaching out because they might have had that trauma previously. And there's so much internalized homophobia, biphobia, and transphobia too, from being told your whole life that something is wrong with you. You internalize that. And that can really come out. It can be a risk factor as well, but it can also impact how you think people see you, which is also about trauma-informed care. So thank you so much. That is all we have for right now. So thank you for joining us and yeah.
Thank you both for guiding us through the new updates and for really sharing concrete examples and experiences. I think it was really helpful to do that and like really grounding it in, and illustrating that through, the key points. So we are planning to still wrap up at 2 p.m. Eastern time, so we don't have too much time for questions right now. I thought maybe I could try with one. We did receive a couple, but I would just so there was a question from the audience about language. So when we use the phrase women and gender diverse people, do you think that that clearly includes trans people, or should trans identities be named more specifically?
You go ahead, Tara.
I think it's really helpful to include trans folks. You can say gender diverse. I have to say, a lot of the people who will be accessing your services might not be familiar with that language that might be at risk. So just clearly stating trans folks, it also helps break down, it also really helps break down bias when people are seeing that this is something that is accepted, that people are accessing services. It helps to really show that you support that community as well. So it sort of has two prongs. To be helpful, but everybody's going to feel a little bit differently. But I feel from our point of view, listing trans is helpful.
Thank you. And that's all the time that we do have right now. So thank you so much. So on behalf of Neighbors, Friends and Families, NFF, thank you to everyone who's joined us today. Obviously, a special thanks to our presenters for sharing their time and their knowledge, and to the team that's working behind the scenes to support this session today. Just a friendly reminder that an evaluation form will open automatically in your browser once this Zoom session ends. And after completing, you will receive a certificate of participation. I'm also just going to pop in the chat to say if you have any questions or feedback or would like to connect with the NFF team, I'll share the email. And if for those who might not be already subscribed to the NFF mailing list, I'll also share that information in the chat. So thanks again to everyone for joining us today.